Kính thưa quý vị, cách đây mấy tháng thì Tô Uyên đã có dịp phỏng vấn giáo sư Nguyễn Thanh Việt, tác giả cuốn sách mang tên The Sympathizer. Và chính tác phẩm này đã đem lại đến cho ông một cái vinh dự đoạt giải thưởng cao quý Pulitzer 2016 của Hoa Kỳ ở thể loại văn chương trong nhóm giải văn chương kịch nghệ và âm nhạc. Ngoài giải Pulitzer 2016 thì tác phẩm này của ông đã đoạt được nhiều giải thưởng văn chương khác. Tô Uyên xin chúc mừng nhà văn Nguyễn Thanh Việt, người Việt Nam đầu tiên đoạt giải Pulitzer. Và Tô Uyên xin mời quý khán thính giả xem lại buổi phỏng vấn nhà văn Nguyễn Thanh Việt. Trước khi bắt đầu cuộc phỏng vấn thì xin cho Tô Uyên giới thiệu lại đôi nét về nhà văn này. Nguyễn Thanh Việt, ông sinh ra ở Việt Nam nhưng trưởng thành ở Mỹ. Anh viết nhiều chuyện cho tạp chí và nhật báo và viết một cuốn sách giáo khoa có tên Race and Resistance. Giáo sư Nguyễn Thanh Việt hiện đang dạy môn Anh ngữ và môn Mỹ học tại Đại học USC và đang sống tại thành phố Los Angeles. Cuốn sách mới nhất của ông tên The Sympathizer là một tiểu thuyết nói về cuộc chiến Việt Nam, được viết bằng tiếng Anh và được khen ngợi là một tác phẩm mới lạ. Cuốn sách phần nào nói về cuộc chiến ở một khía cạnh khác mà người Tây phương thường không hiểu, và có lẽ ngay cả độc giả người Mỹ cũng chưa bao giờ nghe nói đến từ trước tới nay. Tác giả Nguyễn Thanh Việt có một lối kể chuyện khôi hài, châm biếm và rất dí dòm, với nhiều hứa hẹn tương lai. Thưa quý vị, trong chương trình ngày hôm nay thì chúng tôi rất là hân hạnh xin được gọi là giáo sư Nguyễn Thanh Việt nhận lời đến Đài SB10 cho cuộc phỏng vấn đặc biệt này. Và Tô Uyên cũng gọi là hồi hộp là bởi vì thấy rằng là giáo sư rất là tài giỏi, và lái xe từ trên thành phố LA xuống đây là một cái gọi là một cái sự hy sinh cũng khá lớn. Và cho chúng tôi xin được tiếp chuyện với giáo sư bằng Anh ngữ trong ngày hôm nay, thưa quý vị, bởi vì giáo sư xin phép ở đây cũng 40 năm nên tiếng Anh thì giáo sư cảm thấy giáo sư thoải mái hơn. Wow, so I'm so pleased to have you in the studio today. I imagine things have been crazy for you lately. A hot new book out, and plus you starting a new year at USC. So tell me, how has it been doing publicity for the book?
Well, it's been great. I mean, this is part of the publicity for the book. And yes. It's a real pleasure. It's not a sacrifice to drive down here to meet you and to do this show, which I've heard about. And it's my regret that I can't do the interview in Vietnamese.
No problem.
But I think it's been great to do the publicity, because part of what I'm doing with the publicity is to spread the word about this novel, which really brings a new perspective on the Vietnam War to both Americans and Vietnamese, whether we're talking about the Vietnamese in Vietnam or the Vietnamese here.
So anything unusual or surprising happened during the tour, publicity tour?
Well, I think what's unusual is I get to meet people with all kinds of different stories. So I get to meet Americans who were in Vietnam and for different kinds of reasons. I get to meet Vietnamese people who grew up there and they want to share their stories with me. And the most important thing so far has been to meet older Vietnamese people who have been able to read the book in English, who have affirmed with me this is something that they haven't seen before, and that it's a really important perspective to bring to American and also Vietnamese American audiences too.
You know, I'm sorry, your book caught my eye when it was reviewed in the New York Times 3 months ago. And that was, to me, that was such a positive review. Did you hear from many friends and fans who read it? And what do you think of the review?
It was a really great review. It was actually the second review in the New York Times. And so the first review, I just want to talk about that, because the first review was actually a much bigger review. And it started off by saying that I give voice to the voiceless. And I really objected to that, because you and I both know that Vietnamese people in the United States have voices. We talk a lot. Yes. We talk very loudly.
The voiceless, I would say, back home then.
Yeah. But the thing is that Americans can't hear these voices because they don't listen to Vietnamese, they don't read Vietnamese, and even when we're translated into English, they don't really know about us. So on the one hand, the novel, I think, is important in bringing a perspective that hasn't been heard before, but at the same time, we've been trying to tell our stories in Vietnamese and in English for decades now, and it's been a real struggle to get other people to hear them.
Why is that? Can you share your opinion? Why is it so hard to share a story to the mainstream?
Well, the mainstream white Americans, basically, they have a particular memory of the Vietnam War, and that memory is about them. For Americans,
from their perspective.
From their perspective. Yeah. For Americans, the Vietnam War is actually an American war that was fought between Americans, and we, even though it was our country, we're the bystanders to this American war, and they have a very hard time understanding or wanting to hear the stories of the people who they fought for in Vietnam, and then the refugees that came over here as well. So it's been a real frustration for so many of us growing up in the United States and realizing that Americans don't understand what the Vietnamese went through.
But now they do after reading your book.
I hope so.
A lot of them, I'm sure they now see a bigger and a more clear picture after reading The Sympathizer. So I'm curious, has it helped sales of the book, do you think?
The publicity?
Yes.
Or in the reviews? Absolutely. Both.
The reviews and the publicity.
Yeah, absolutely. My editor is happy. That's important.
Yeah.
I earned out the advance on the book, so it's making money, and that's what they care about, in addition to the good reviews. So yeah, I mean, it's done very well for a first novel and for a serious novel. It's literary fiction, and so it's a difficult book in some ways, but people are still picking it up.
Interesting points. A literary fiction, but yet it's a difficult book. Can you elaborate just a little bit more?
Well, it's a book that is about a sympathizer. He's a communist spy in the South Vietnamese army in 1975, and his job is to spy on that army and then to flee with that army to the United States, where his communist masters believe the South Vietnamese will try to fight the war again. And so the book is entirely about his psychology, and he has a very conflicted psychology, and I think that's one of the reasons that makes the book a little bit challenging, because we live completely within his mindset and how he's constantly torn between what he believes, the revolution that he believes in, and the fact that he also sympathizes very much for the South Vietnamese that he spies on, and for the Americans that he lives with as well.
Interesting. And how long was the research for you?
My whole life.
Your whole life? Wow.
Well, I mean, I wrote the book in 2 years,
Right.
but I've been thinking about the issues in this novel ever since I came to the United States and started reading about the Vietnam War when I was 10 or 11 and watching movies. And so in a sense, I was always thinking about the Vietnam War and how, we as Vietnamese were excluded from the American perspectives. America's made so many movies about this war, for example, but almost none of them deal with the Vietnamese. So I was waiting for my chance to tell our story.
And so that's why it took you 2 years to finish the book. Interesting point. You mentioned about the editor. He helps you to edit after you finished writing it?
Yeah, the original manuscript was 170,000 words, and the book that we have is 145,000 words.
So you have to shorten down.
We had to shorten. We didn't change anything
Right.
in terms of how the book is written or its structure. We just had to trim back the language and cut a few scenes out.
Were you sad when you had to do that?
Well, you probably know. I mean, having a good editor is really important
Yeah.
to give you a second opinion, to keep you in check, and that's what my editor did for me. He's a very brilliant young guy, and he was 26 when he bought the book.
No.
Yeah, and but he was graduated from Oxford in England, and he studied Russian literature.
Wow.
So in many ways, he was the perfect guy because I knew my novel could be understood by people who were not Americans and who had no connection to the Vietnam War or to Vietnamese people. And he is, one of the key audiences that I wanted to reach are just people who have nothing to do with us, but who should still be interested in what happened to us.
So you had to search for I would say the perfect editor to help you edit this book. Otherwise, you would not be happy if you didn't find this guy.
There were other editors, and some of them wanted to change the book in different ways,
In
make
which
it more
you
of a
don't-
love story. No, absolutely not.
There's no love in this.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
There's a lot of sex. I don't know how the audience will react to that, but there is quite a bit of sex. Yeah.
How about intimacy?
Yes.
Intimacy.
Yes.
That's better. So there's so much to talk about in this book, but can you start with the story? Why the story, and how did you get inspired to tell this incredible story?
Well, I grew up in the Vietnamese community in San Jose, and have heard a lot of Vietnamese people of the older generation tell their stories. And one of the things that's very obvious to me is that they've been through very difficult, terrible things, and they're very, as a result, attached to their history and their point of view. And that's really important. But at the same time, it's hard to move forward when we're always talking about the past and from one perspective. And when you go to Vietnam, I've been to Vietnam many times, it's the same thing. The Vietnamese official perspective is very much one story. So I wanted to write a story that was not about one point of view, but about someone who could see our complicated history from both sides, from both the communist side and from the non-communist side. And that's part of the point of the book, is that if we want to be able to get past our history and to move forward as Vietnamese people in Vietnam and the United States, we have to be able to talk with each other. And my character talks with himself all the time about different ways to interpret the history and the politics.
When you say you talk with themselves, you mean talk with yourself or talk with these imaginary characters in your head with yourself in your own room?
Well, the narrator, it's told entirely from his point of view. So he's talking with himself, but he's also encountering all these different people. He encounters Americans, communists, non-communists, and he is constantly debating with himself, what is the right way? What is the right thing to do?
Conflicted?
Yeah, it's deeply conflicted.
Yeah.
But we come from a history that's deeply conflicted. The central question of the novel that he asks himself is, what is to be done?
Yes.
We're faced with
what's right, what's wrong?
What's right? Yeah, what's right, what's wrong?
Yes.
And the conclusion that he reaches is that what makes tragedy happen is not a conflict of right versus wrong. It's right versus right. It's when both sides believe they are right that we have tragedy. And I think that's what happened in Vietnam. Whether or not we believe in communism or not, the communists believed
what they're doing is right.
Right, and we believe what we were doing was right. That's our tragedy. That's why we were been fighting each other for so long, and why we're still angry, some of us, angry at each other.
Very interesting. For most Americans, the history of the Vietnam War was told mostly by American writers, like you mentioned earlier. So I'm just curious that how important was it, for you to give Americans another point of view on the war and on the Vietnamese people?
Very important. Not just American books, but American politics, American presidents, American movie makers. They've all been telling this war from their perspective.
Yes.
And this book is an argument against that. This book most of this book is about Vietnamese people, about the North and the South, communist, anti-communist, Buddhist, Catholic. And so the basic point of the book is, this was our war, this is our history. We have to tell it from our point of view. And the Americans, they're important, but they're the bystanders in our history. And the book is also my revenge on American culture. I mean, I don't know if you grew up watching like Apocalypse Now or any of these kinds of movies. I watched a lot of these movies, and I love war movies, but at a certain point you watch these movies and you realize the Vietnamese people are the ones getting killed. Who am I supposed to applaud for? And so there's a very long section of the book that deals with the making of a movie like Apocalypse Now, but from our point of view, and it's a satire. It's a comic novel about that.
So when you mentioned that part, what was the reaction of the readers who can totally see a better picture after reading this book and recognize that, especially Hollywood producers and directors are like, oh shoot, that was wrong of us.
Yeah.
Did they reach out to you and say, sorry, man?
Not yet.
Not yet.
But I think that part of the novel really resonates with a lot of Americans, because they understand that that's what actually is happening. When you point it out to them, they're like, that's right. We've made some terrible movies about this. And one of the points of the book is that typically it's the victors who write history. But in the case of the Vietnam War, it's the losers who wrote the history. The Americans lost the war, but they get to write the history. And, all the Vietnamese of all sides are excluded or marginalized in that American history.
Did you ask your parents for any sort of tips or advice or stories prior to writing this book?
No.
You just want to have a very neutral mind?
Yeah, but my parents, they don't like to talk about the past, and it's very hard to communicate with them. I mean, I know some of their stories that they told me over the years. They're horrible stories about what it was like to grow up in the 1930s and the 1940s in North Vietnam, 1950s, and living through the war.
Famine time.
Famine,
yes.
War.
Japanese occupation,
right.
yes.
They were refugees in 1954,
yes.
refugees in 1975.
Yes.
We had a very difficult time leaving the country because my father was in Saigon, but my mother and my brother and I were in Ban Ma Thuột. Ban Ma Thuột was the first town to be taken in March of 1975, right? So
how old were you then?
I was 4.
Okay.
So my mother had to make some very dramatic decisions to try to get us out to Saigon. So I mean, all that is in the back of my mind, but I didn't have to ask my parents about that, because really I'd already read so much about the Vietnam War and read so much about what the Vietnamese people went through and oral histories and things like that. So all of that is present in the novel.
Xin quý vị khán thính giả vẫn tiếp tục giữ màn hình SBTN. Chúng tôi sẽ trở lại trong giây lát. Chúng tôi xin cảm ơn sự theo dõi trở lại của quý vị khán thính giả. Thưa quý vị, tôi đang tiếp chuyện với giáo sư nhà văn Uyen Thanh Việt về cuốn sách mới nhất của ông mang tên The Sympathizer. Và trong phần 2 thì chúng tôi xin được hỏi rõ hơn với giáo sư về khi mà lớn lên tại Hoa Kỳ thì cái cuộc sống như thế nào bằng tiếng Anh, thưa quý vị. Bởi vì giáo sư sống tại Hoa Kỳ cũng 40 năm nên ông xin phép là cho tiếp xúc cái buổi nói chuyện ngày hôm nay bằng Anh ngữ. Ông nói là ông hơi hồi hộp, nếu mà nói tiếng Việt mà lỡ mà nói gì sai thì quý vị sẽ buồn. So, cho tôi xin được bắt đầu cái buổi nói chuyện phần 2 với tiếng Anh, thưa quý vị. So, can we talk a little bit about your background? You were born in Vietnam and grew up here in America. When did you come over to the States?
Well, in April 1975, because we were lucky enough to be a part of that first wave of refugees fleeing from Saigon. And then we moved to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, because that was where one of the refugee camps was in Indiantown Gap, and spent a few years there. And my parents looked around and they realized there's no economic opportunity in Harrisburg. So they moved to San Jose, and they opened one of the first Vietnamese grocery stores in San Jose.
No way.
Yeah, so that was in the 1980s, and so I had a very intimate view of life in the Vietnamese community in San Jose in the 1980s.
Did you still remember your first feeling arriving to Pennsylvania?
Yeah, because what happened was my parents and I were separated. Sponsors took my parents, another set of sponsors took my brother, and then I was taken away by another sponsor. So I was 4 years old, and
why did they do that?
They could not find somebody who would take all 4 of us. I don't know. This was very unusual, I guess. And so my first memory of coming to America was being traumatized because I was taken away from my parents, and felt like a very long time. And I think that's always.
You were only 4 then,
4,
right?
Yeah.
And so when did you actually finally reunite with your parents and your brother?
It was only a few months.
Okay.
But when you're 4, it feels like a very long time.
Yes, yes. So growing up, did you feel like you always, fit into the American society?
No. I felt like I didn't fit into American society, and I felt like I didn't fit into Vietnamese society either. So I was really someone who was in between.
What's the term for that?
In between?
In between.
I don't know if there's any term.
In Vietnamese, I would call like thịt ba rọi. Half fat and half non-fat.
Okay.
Because you feel like you don't belong and you don't fit into any, right.
Yeah, but I think that was good for becoming a writer. If you feel like you don't fit in, then you try to make sense of why you don't fit in. And it also allowed me to see, again, what was limited about the American viewpoint about the Vietnamese and what was limited about the Vietnamese viewpoint about what had happened to them. So I could see both communities from the inside and the outside.
At what age do you realize that you wanted to become a writer?
I wrote my first book when I was 7 or 8 years old, a little short book.
No way.
But so I've been writing my entire life, but I really started writing seriously 15 years ago. And I wrote a short story collection about our experience as Vietnamese people, and that's what brought me my agent, who told me you have to write a novel because that's how you get published in New York City. So then I wrote the novel in a couple of years.
So now, of course, you're very busy because not only you've been doing traveling for the publicity, but you're teaching at USC. Tell us about experience working there, and are there a lot of Vietnamese students taking your English and literature class? Well,
I teach literature classes and I teach American studies classes, ethnic studies, but very particularly the course that I care about a lot is the Vietnam War course that I do, which covers all the different experiences and perspectives on the Vietnam War, including Vietnamese of all sides. But 200 people and maybe 5 to 10 Vietnamese students will take that class, which makes me very sad because I think a lot of the students at the campus are much more interested in medicine and business and getting ahead, and they're not interested in learning about their history and what happened to them and their parents.
So what do you think, is there a way to reach out to the Vietnamese students and maybe encourage them to take your class and learn more about the history?
That's what I'm doing right now. Come and take the class.
You can look straight in the camera and tell these students,
it's important to learn about your history, and it's rare. But I think USC is a very different place than the UC Irvine, where there's a lot of Vietnamese students. At USC, people are a little more isolated.
So I assume USC is a good job for you, and is it a good place for you to teach there?
Oh, absolutely. It's an enormously wealthy university in Los Angeles, so there's a lot of benefits to that. But the drawback, again, is we don't get a lot of Vietnamese students because they want to stay in Orange County, or they think that going to University of California is cheaper.
Is it cheaper?
Well, in absolute dollar terms, it is cheaper because it costs about $64,000 a year to go to USC. But financial aid means that sometimes it's cheaper to go to USC than it is to go to a UC campus.
Well, that's good to know,
Yeah,
because
that's
I'm
good to
sure
know, right.
the students would love to
Yeah.
hear the tips how to get, accepted into USC and then get financial aid.
Right.
It's so interesting because I'm sure a lot of the Vietnamese viewers, they haven't heard about the Sympathizer, and now they get to hear from you. And are you planning to have this book translated in Vietnamese and released in Vietnam? Are you?
Well, I think Vietnam's largest private publisher wants to translate the book into Vietnamese, and I'm talking with them about it, the various terms.
Yes.
But my major concern is I cannot have the book censored in any way. And if you read the book, the last third of the book is a very serious condemnation of the Vietnamese Communist Party, the re-education camp policy, the boat people policy, and I have a hard time imagining that the censorship board in Vietnam will allow this book to be published as it is. So that is a very big concern. I don't know how that's going to work out.
Well, because in this book, pretty much everyone is target in your book, right? And your humor is it's very out there. So, like you said, they might have a hard time accepting your humor.
Well, I think that means that the Vietnamese American community here should be ready to, if they read the book in English or if they read it in Vietnamese, that there's a lot of satire directed at the Vietnamese American and South Vietnamese communities as well.
Do you have any plans to release or write another book in the coming months or year?
Well, I have a book coming out in April from Harvard University Press called Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam and the Memory of War, which is my academic work about how this war has been remembered by the United States, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Korea, and the Southeast Asian diasporas. And then I've started to write the sequel to The Sympathizer.
Wow. Are you planning to maybe turn into a film? And so for the mainstream to see, at least they understand more, because I'm sure the Apocalypse Now is something like you mentioned, it's from the Hollywood perspective, the American perspective,
Right.
not really from ours.
Well, of course I would love to have it made into a movie, and if Francis Ford Coppola is worth watching, or Sofia Coppola, talk to me.
So I assume that he's one of your favorite directors, Francis Coppola, because his name is somewhat referenced in this book.
Yeah, I mean, it's, Apocalypse Now. It's a movie I grew up watching. I feel very conflicted about it because I think it's a great work of art, but it's also a film that, depicts the Vietnamese in a horrible way.
Is there like a film that you've seen, I don't know, in recent years and say, okay, at least they're getting somewhere in Hollywood. At least they tell a neutral or decent story about us, or you haven't seen one yet?
Well, I mean, there was a lot of interest in Rory Kennedy's documentary, Last Days in Saigon, which, it tries, but I have a lot of problems with that documentary because it's a very limited viewpoint about what happened there. But at least it tries.
It's from her perspective.
It's from her perspective.
Yeah.
I'm very excited about a very large documentary that's coming out from Ken Burns. I've met his co-producer, and it's a very extensive documentary about the history of the Vietnam War. And they've interviewed a lot of Vietnamese Americans and Vietnamese people, so I'm optimistic that we'll see something more substantive from Ken Burns.
And I hope that he already finished reading your book, so at least he have a better, a wider, clearer perspective.
I don't know if he has, but his co-producer has. That we met and we
Good.
talked about this book.
Good. So, thanks for coming down to your Little Saigon SB10 studio. Do you want to say something in Vietnamese before we have to leave?
Cảm ơn nhiều lắm. Tôi rất buồn vì không nói chuyện được bằng tiếng Việt. Sống ở đây 40 năm rồi thì nói tiếng Đức Anh là dễ hơn, mà Việt đã quyết định nói tiếng Anh vì Việt muốn nói chuyện với người Mỹ. Yeah, so I apologize, but I'm glad that we had this opportunity to do the interview, and it'll be subtitled in Vietnamese for people to read.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Viet Nguyen. I know that you're a busy man, so thank you for coming down, and best of luck to everything.
Thank you.
Tôi Uyen cảm ơn giáo sư Nguyễn Thanh Việt đã dành cho chúng tôi buổi phỏng vấn hôm nay, và cũng xin giới thiệu cùng quý khán thính giả tác phẩm The Sympathizer. Hy vọng quý vị sẽ tìm thấy nhiều điều thú vị qua cách trình bày dí dòm của tác giả. Một lần nữa, xin chúc mừng giáo sư Nguyễn Thanh Việt, người Việt Nam đầu tiên đoạt giải Pulitzer 2016. Và Tô Uyên cũng cảm ơn sự theo dõi của quý vị.